This is Gabriel Messuti, and you're listening to Learn, Unlearn, Optimize. All right, guys, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Eat or Be Eaten on Learn, Unlearn, Optimize with Gabriel Messuti and Michael Pellegrino. So we're recording from home today. It's snowing pretty crazy out there right now. So if you hear any background noise, I got my daughter and my wife in the kitchen right now as we're recording, but we're doing the best we can to make sure we stay consistent. How you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing all right. Yeah.
You got a lot of snow. You got a lot of snow down there?
Not too much. It's manageable.
Oh, cool, man.
It's a manageable day, but it's one of those days you just want to be inside and drink some warm tea and
nice, man.
Just get other things done.
That's it. It's a good catch-up day. So, guys, we're going to jump right into it here. The constituents of food, the different parts that make up our food. And we're going to start with the first four: carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and oils. And within proteins are the amino acids, which is a big one for me that I hope we can get pretty deep into. Mm-hmm. All right, Mike, blast off.
All right. So like recapping what we talked about previous two sessions about whole foods and the energetics. And to elaborate upon that, like, yes, our food is made up of those basic elements that a lot of us know as carbohydrates, proteins, amino acids, fats and oils, and then also including minerals, vitamins, phytonutrients, especially if it's coming from plants, all these other compounds that are in there. But we have to understand that these nutrients are not existing in an isolated environment. They're not separate, but in fact, they are in a whole food matrix, in a complex. Because isolates, they don't actually metabolize or are digested and absorbed in the same way that a whole food complex is. So when you go into the health food stores or wherever online, you buy those vitamins, those minerals, all those compounds, those amino acids, formulations, those are isolates. Those are fractions. Those are a purified compound of one particular compound, one element. It's not existing in a whole food matrix. And so you often find those formulations in really high amounts. You go and get a B12 supplement, for instance, you'll find that in 20,000, 50,000% of the recommended daily value. The reason is because as a whole food, as an isolate, it doesn't have the ability to absorb quite well. So they have to get these levels to be really high because you're only absorbing a fraction of that. So isolates are poorly absorbed. Also, they can increase the risk of getting toxicity because there's no control mechanism. They're essentially like drugs in that a drug is a purified, isolated compound. And so you bring that into the body, it can enhance or increase the risk for toxicity. And then the other thing too is that it is there to alter the biochemical pathways. It's like steering the rudder on a ship or steering the wheel of a car, take it into one direction or another. So unless you know what you're doing, you may be taking a synthetic isolated compound and steering into the wrong direction. Also, these isolates, because they are on their own and not with the other food, right? Other nutrients that are part of food, so that nutrient can actually be metabolized appropriately. If you take an isolate, it's going to start pulling other elements, resources from your body so that isolate is able to be properly metabolized. So in fact, an isolate can create a deficiency in another part of the body. So that's where we have to get back to whole foods. And I want to talk about mostly on this one about carbohydrates, proteins, and fats/oils, because those are the three predominant constituents, compounds that make up most of our body and what is important for this life cycle. Because again, life has a cycle to it. You know, we're born, we have this period of rapid growth and development, then we have this maintenance period, and then we have our decline, and then recycling. So there's this whole life cycle. You know, it's also especially in like plant, the plant study of botany and agriculture. Some of you may know of this carbon nitrogen cycle. And so that we're a part of that cycle. So when we talk about the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats and oils, we have to understand that in the context of this whole carbon nitrogen cycle. Whereas carbohydrates represent more of that carbon side, and they're going to provide more of an alkaline effect for the body and more of a growing, a building up effect. It's more of that in terms of life cycle, the birth part and growth part. And then you've got the nitrogen part of it, which is the decay. And that's often represented by the protein. So proteins are very rich in nitrogen, and proteins are made up of amino acids. And so those, as the that word amino acids, the last word in that is acid. So the proteins will actually contribute to that breaking down part in the carbon nitrogen cycle. So it leads also more to that acidic component. So any questions right now, Gabe? Because that was a lot right there.
Yeah, that was awesome. I didn't want to interrupt you. So a couple things. I have a question on the plant analogy.
Yeah.
Can you say that again?
So plants are, well, we as well, but all like life forms like us humans, other animals, and plants, we are carbon-based life forms. We are built up of carbon. You know, that is
what does that even mean, Mike?
So what that means is that in the periodic table of elements, we have a wide distribution of elements from the periodic table within us. But the most predominant compounds that make up our molecules, that make up who we are made up of carbons. So carbons are what we need, what we're made up of, and what we need to consume in order to support that regeneration process. And so carbohydrates, again, carbon, and then hydrates, hydrated meaning water, hydration. We are water. I'm sure you've heard this. Many people have heard this, that about 60, 70% of our body is made up of water. So we are very rich in water and also carbon. And so the carbon is what makes us who we are. And we need that carbon-based life forms, also known as plants, to provide us with that life energy, or in a carbohydrate form, so that we can fuel our own biochemistry and help our body to rebuild, because it takes energy to rebuild, to repair.
So I hear that a lot, that carbohydrates give you energy.
Yes.
Like that's like, okay, you want energy, eat carbs, which I've also heard then, like you can also get energy from fats as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be carbohydrates, but I grew up, you know, we're going to play football. You have to go to the pasta dinner. You're going to load up on pasta to get, which is just really paste and gluten. And that's a whole nother conversation,
Sure.
But it's also a form of carbohydrates that they said was going to give us a lot of energy. So Mike, carbohydrates, carbs are short for carbohydrates. Yes.
Carbs? Yeah.
Yes.
People say carbs, exactly.
Yep. So now I'm really interested in what you said about carbohydrate, carbon, and hydration. Is the compound, what makes up a carbohydrate? Is it carbon and water? Is it like, and how does that give our body energy?
Yeah. So essentially you have more of those hydroxyl ions, so basically OH groups.
You got it. All right. What is a hydro?
In chemistry represents more of that alkaline side of the scale. So if we're looking at the pH scale of acid and base, okay, where a lower the pH is, 0 is the lowest, and then going up to 14. So within that scale, we want to be as close to the neutral as possible, with slight degree of alkalinity. All right. If we get too far one or the other, that's when we'll die, especially if the blood gets too much one way or the other.
Quick question, Mike. All this water it's 9.9, it's at this much alkalinity. Is that BS? Could that tip us too far the other way?
For sure. Anything can tip us one way or the other. And so maintaining acid-base balance is critical, because if we're taking in too much acid-forming foods or waters or any other compounds that leave our body in the more acidic state, we're going to break down. And possibly, if the blood, for instance, gets too acidic, we're going to die. We're going to go into metabolic acidosis. If we go the other way, especially for the blood, it goes into alkalosis, metabolic alkalosis. So we don't want to be in one or the other. We want to maintain that balance.
So what was it when you used to tell me the issue's tissue? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you would laugh and say, oh, it doesn't matter how much pH is in the water or what you're doing. You're putting lemons in your water. Like, maybe to a certain, it'll help somewhere, but the issue's tissue. What did you mean by that?
Oh, well, we always say that the issues that we have, we hold them within our tissues.
Right.
So we're kind of playing on the words in that regard. But
was it also that the tissues, my interpretation also, the issues are in the tissues. We say that in yoga too, for more of an emotional and
for sure.
And things that they manifest in the tissues. But isn't it also that the tissues are holding a lot of the toxins, or the tissues are holding a lot of these things that are going to make the body acidic or make the body swing one way or the other. So just the flushing of the water isn't always going to change that. Drinking a high form of pH isn't necessarily going to detox the tissues per se.
Well, that's right, because the way that the body, without getting too much off on tangent, but the way that the body will detox is dependent upon the resources that the body has to conduct that detox. And so there's all these different detoxification pathways on a biochemical level, on a physiological level, that play a role in, is that organ, let's say the muscles, is it holding on to acidic acid, metabolic waste, or is it releasing that? Is it able to flush out? There's all sorts of other systems that are involved in that process. But I wanted to really kind of bring it back to what you're saying about with carbohydrates, and that it representing what is it made up of, right? It's simple. It's really, they're carbon rich sugars.
Well, and bring it back to the hydroxyl, we got on that, hydroxyl ion.
Yeah. So in the whole acid base and base balance, the more free hydrogen there is, because water, let's start a base. I got to start the foundation. Forgot to do that. So water is H2O, right? 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Now that disassociates, water as a fluid into hydrogen, free hydrogen, and an oxygen hydrogen combined. And so when in existence, it's always fluctuating between one or the other, between giving up the hydrogen ion or having it attached as an H2O complex. So the pH of the water tells us, is there more hydrogen that's free, or is there more OH that is available? So it's really a measure of that. Is there more OH groups, or is there more free electrons of hydrogen?
Okay.
So
this may be stupid simple for someone listening, and maybe like nails on a chalkboard if you guys are good at chemistry, which evidently I'm not.
This is
yet.
Hard stuff.
Yeah.
I will
So
say.
at what point does it turn into hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2? Like, is that, or is that just completely outside of this conversation?
That's going to get into another conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. I really want to bring this though with the fact that, with back to carbohydrates and why they're really important, because, carbohydrates are made up of these carbon rich sugars. And I use sugars in quotes here because when people hear the word sugars, they think of something bad, right? They think of the white sugar that's put in processed foods and sodas and teas, all of that. I'm not talking about, well, that is considered a carbohydrate. It's a simple carbohydrate. But more than that, it's an isolate. Again, when the processing of that,
The refinement.
the refinement of it, the highly refined white sugar is no more than a drug, as far as I'm concerned. It's not food anymore.
And actually the byproduct of everything they leave behind, the molasses, has a lot of nutrients in it, right?
Yeah. So when you're making white refined sugar from sugar cane, then you're left with the blackstrap molasses, which is rich in everything that was from the sugar cane, all the vitamins and minerals and other phytonutrients.
That's the whole food.
As much as possible. Yeah.
Can be.
Close to it. Yeah.
Got it.
But yeah, the white stuff you want to stay away from because it's, carbohydrates have a lot of energy to them. They're the primary energy for the human body. We're a carbon-based life form that runs on a carbohydrate metabolism. This goes way, way, way back to our ancient ancestors. And, yes, the body is highly adaptable. So can we shift our metabolism to running on fatty acids? Most definitely we can. That is definitely possible, and it has certain therapeutic use. But for the most part, for most of us, we want to be efficiently working with carbohydrates. The problem that people run in with carbohydrates is that they're eating too many of these refined, highly processed carbohydrates, and they're not exercising. Okay, so you're getting in this energy dense food, and you're not putting it to work. So it leads to all sorts of metabolic dysfunctions.
So Mike, let me break that down real quick, how I heard it. So we take in these carbohydrates, and not only are we taking in the proper carbohydrates, which are the whole food and the ones that are easily digested by our body. So even the good carbohydrates that are whole foods and easily digested by our body that don't necessarily cause too much of a deficit one way or the other, if not used, can increase weight because it's stored up energy. So those on their own could be potentially detrimental like anything else. Absolutely. But now we're taking it to another level. So we're taking refined sugar, we're taking refined white flour and breads and simple carbohydrates that are broken down that are fractions like we spoke about in the other episodes.
Right.
And like we spoke in the beginning of this episode, can then cause a deficit because in order for the body to digest a fraction or a fractile, it needs to bring other resources in to make it think that it's a whole food, which then can cause deficits in other places.
Yeah, you nailed it.
So now
you absolutely nailed it.
Now I'm not only gaining weight, but I kind of just compounded my problem because I took in a fraction of a food, which is going to have me gain weight, but then it's going to cause deficits in other places because my body's going to pull its other resources and deplete in other areas. So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, you really nailed it there. I love that explanation.
Cool, man.
Yeah, we're on the same page.
All right, thank you. I'm up to speed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's what white sugar is. That white refined stuff, it'll just pull all of the resources that it needs to metabolize that by pulling it from your own body. And so it leads to significant deficiencies.
But not just white sugar, there's other stuff too, or any type of fraction will do that,
any
right?
type of fraction.
So now, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so with the carbohydrates, again, we're not talking about carbohydrates in an isolated form here. We're talking about as part of a plant, of a whole food matrix, and mostly we're talking about plants.
So now we're switching to the full good carbohydrates which can be detrimental if not used and eaten too much, and you don't use the energy. Right. So now we're on the good part. Okay.
Yeah. So if we're eating mostly plants, then we're getting plenty of carbohydrates. That's the plant's energy. So the plants, they take in sun energy, sunlight, right? They're taking that in, and through a process of photosynthesis, is transforming that sun energy into carbohydrates and other compounds that plant needs to survive and even thrive.
Okay.
and to be resilient. And then we as another carbon-based life form literally are taking in that sun energy in a form that we know how to work with. And we take that into our body and we're allowed to rebuild our own body and fuel our needs, to fuel
Okay.
our own life energy. And so being that carbohydrates and that the carbon represents more of that life side of that carbon nitrogen cycle, we want to be eating those plants. We want to make sure too that we're eating that food in proper balance. So yes, there are some whole foods that are more starchy than other foods. There are some foods that have what are known as simple carbohydrates. There are other foods that have more complex. So the starchy foods are more complex carbohydrate, which means that these sugars, also known as like mono or polysaccharides, they are in a more complex configuration and longer chains, rather than simple carbohydrates, which are in smaller chains. For instance, fruits will have more of these simple carbohydrates.
So we took good carbohydrates. We got clear on the bad and all that.
Mm-hmm.
We took now we're at good carbohydrates, and you just subdivided good carbohydrates, and they break down into simple carbs.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the other one?
Simple carbs, complex carbs.
And the difference is
The difference is the way that it's arranged, the chains of those carbohydrates.
and when you say chains, what's that? The actual
So
structure?
the structure, the chemical structure, the molecular structure.
The molecular structure.
Of
Okay.
these
And
compounds.
And the longer the chain, the more complex?
Not only the longer the chain, but also how it is arranged, the shape and how it's arranged within the plant. What else it's combined with also plays a role. But essentially, it's the length as well as the configuration of those.
So now we're getting
molecules.
into geometry.
Yeah, it's all geometry.
Wow.
Everything's math and geometry, and the relationship between those.
What is it
angles.
about the shape, Mike? How does the shape affect it?
Well, shape is everything. Shape, or I'll substitute that word shape for structure. And so one of the fundamental principles when you're learning chemistry is that structure necessitates form. It determines the form, or the function, not the form, but the function. So form or structure determines the function that's going to exhibit. So
Give me an example.
well, I mean, you can even look at it on a gross level. If you take a scissors, right? Scissors are in a specific structure in order to perform that function of cutting. If it was not in that structure, it would not perform that function.
Am I
So
thinking?
that's on the most simple level.
My mind went down to like the 5 platonic solids of sacred geometry, like the building blocks. Is that where we're at, or
no,
that's?
let's keep it more big, and not that.
But so it's
that
not
abstract,
like,
which is cool. I like what you're thinking.
So when you said like the angle, so it's not like triangle is going to do this, hexagon is going to do that. Is it actually forming a structure by the chain? Is it making an actual shape, and these shapes have to fit together?
Well, I'll say that everything comes down to energy, and energy is condensed in particular structures in a crystalline form, crystals. And so crystals have different configurations.
Wow.
Right? And then crystals can become more complex and build upon each other and combine with other crystalline elements or crystalline entities to create more complex formations. And so we humans are a living crystal that are made up of all these other smaller crystals. And then that can just goes on and on and on, from from the whole being to the organ system level to the biochemical level and so forth, and to the quantum physical level. But it's all the same thing at the end of the day, just a different perspective, macrocosmic, microcosmic perspective of looking at it.
Okay.
Uh, yeah.
All right.
But
No,
yeah,
this, I mean, this
so
is what happens. That's why I wanted to do this,
I
this,
love it.
this
We can get so
podcast, Mike.
deep, Gabe. We can
Yeah.
get so deep
And it,
into it.
it's also like, you have to have, or I do, I get to
Mhm.
have context. It's like, it's simple, but it's also so complex. And in order to
Mhm.
really understand it, sometimes you have to work around it a little bit to create the context, ask the questions,
Mhm.
because like, yeah, you can spit out this information, but without the rest of the context around it, or without you having
Totally.
other bits, like that's what the quote unquote a holistic health is, right?
Yeah.
Because
And
it's,
and I love that we can have, and we ought to, which I love that we're doing,
yeah,
to have the context from that macrocosmic and microcosmic perspective, because some people might understand it from a macrocosmic perspective. Some may see it at a more abstract way. Some people need to understand it on a detail level. So
yeah.
I'm glad we're like getting all into this.
Well,
This is fantastic.
I intentionally, even if you, when you
Mhm.
send me stuff, Mike, I
Yeah.
intentionally come in cold because I want to come in as the person that just has the base knowledge of like what I hear
Yeah.
more or less like with their ear to the street that doesn't
Right.
really have exactly, as deep a knowledge so that we could get this information clear
Mhm.
from a base student white belt level.
Yeah.
All right, dude. So
So
complex and simple carbs and how
yeah.
they affect the body. That's kind of before
So
we
they're both
detour.
needed. They're both needed. Simple carbs, they're going to be breaking down pretty quickly, give us our energy like that.
Hmm.
Whereas the complex carbs, which are in the form generally as starches, which you'll find in things like grains, whole grains, as well as roots, tubers, rhizomes, we're thinking potatoes, beets, yams, you
Uh-huh.
know, radishes, all that stuff that's in the ground.
Uh-huh.
Those are in a much more starchy form because that is carbohydrates that are in a storage form for the plant. So if we
Okay.
think about a plant, the plant, when it fruits
Oh, wow.
and it provides a fruit, that's your simple carbs basically right there. And then when, that happens during the warmer season generally. And then when it's going to the winter season, the energy of the plant goes down,
To the
drops the
bulb.
fruit, drops the leaves many times, and will go down into the ground, into the rhizome or the root,
Wow.
and be in a storage or holding mode until the following season, where that energy now rises up, sprouts up back again if it needs to, or just starts to grow more leaves, grow
Wow.
fruit.
Wow,
That's
Mike.
the cycle of a plant. That's its life cycle.
Wow. So now it's really starting to make some sense to me. So when you look at when we talk about the cycles and we talk about like energetically in last episode, we're talking about expansion and contraction with the
Mm-hmm.
seasons.
Yeah.
The plant's also contracting in, but as the plant does that, it's also storing energy similar to like hibernation, a
Yeah.
bear, anything else that's hibernating to
Right.
prepare itself for the next cycle of when it's going to expand.
Yeah. And
So,
the same thing with us too, like we
so
talked about last
yeah,
episode.
exactly. So by by the fruit of, no pun intended, but the fruit of the plant's labor, when it comes out at the end, is a simple carb, because that's like the tail end of the cycle, and you're going to eat that, and that's kind of got like just it's still a whole food, but it has a fraction of what the complex carb has in it, because it's storing everything. It's taking everything it needs and it's holding it in one spot.
Yeah.
Hence, when we eat, like, that's why it's so nutrient rich, and that's why they can put weight on you so quick if you don't if you don't exercise and get the energy out. That's why a potato or yams or this starchy stuff can put weight on you so quick, because it's so nutrient dense.
It is. And during
Wow.
the cooler season, you know, we want to be putting, well, at least,
You spoke about that last episode,
yeah,
the type of food that you crave.
yeah, but
A stew.
we want, generally speaking, to be consuming those more starchy foods like the roots and tubers during this fall, the winter season, because way back then when we were tribal people,
Yeah.
uh, we needed that in order to carry us through the winter. We needed to put on more body weight. more
Well, also,
fat to insulate us
we
from the
didn't have
cold.
access to the other stuff because that's what would keep.
Right. And so that's another thing that looking at is, where are we in terms of the Earth geographically, right? So if you're living in the equator, you're going to be eating and have access to plenty of fresh fruits and leafy greens and other kinds of um, foods that are going to be more simple carbohydrates to keep you going. You're not going to be focusing on too much of the starchy foods. But if you're living in more colder climates, if you're living higher up in the mountains, even in towards the equator, it's still a colder environment. So you're going to want more of those starchy foods. So it all depends on what is the right fuel that you need for where you are at in your environment. Simple as that. So it's important to evaluate for yourself, where are you?
So, and where are you? What do you have access to? What do you perform on the best? Like, I don't want to derail the conversation out of like, I can also get energy from fats because we'll do a fats episode and then we can talk about
Mhm.
how the two do that. So, Mike, when I do, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, you can
I was going to
go.
say, so when I do get energy, so let's say I have like a nice hearty stew with like potato, like a lot of heavy starch, like potatoes or something like that, right? Forget the meat or no meat right now. Um, how is that? I'm going to store that. I'm going to use that for energy for my performance. Let's say like in jujitsu, or like how's my body reacting to this? Or is that what you're saying? I get to feel that out, or is there kind of like a rule of
For sure.
thumb?
I mean, everybody's body is unique.
That
Everybody's
I know,
body.
but is there like a general rule of thumb or?
General rule of thumb is you take in carbohydrates for energy production. And a complex carb that's in a starchy form, especially, it's going to have a lot of energy that you can use for fuel. And it's going to be relatively broken down more gently rather than a simple sugar, which is going to be a quick burst of energy. Um, Complex starchy carbs are going to be metabolized a bit slower. So it gives us that fuel for more prolonged use. Also, it helps us to rebuild our own glycogen stores, which is the storage form of sugars in our muscles and liver primarily. And that's
Okay.
important.
Did we discuss sugars already today? Other than
So
refinement of sugars and
yeah, so for this conversation especially, I'm using the word sugars
yeah.
in not the way that most of us throw around, but in the way of this is the simple biochemistry of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon-rich sugars that could be in a simple carbohydrate form
Or
or a
complex.
complex carbohydrate form. I'm not talking about the white refined
Yeah, I get that. But what I'm
foods.
saying is now
Mhm.
because but what about the glycogen?
So we take in carbohydrates.
Yeah.
We're going to use some of that to make sure our blood sugar is stabilized, fuel our brain,
Uh-huh.
and all the other organs within our body. But if there's any excess of that, that could be used to rebuild our glycogen stores, which are in our muscles tissue, but
Yeah.
also in our liver.
Okay.
So when we are fasting, which is at nighttime, but
Yeah.
also when we have breaks between our meals, right?
Yeah.
Between, let's say, breakfast and lunch and or dinner,
Yeah.
uh, we have glycogen, which can be broken down to keep our blood sugar steady and also to provide the energy to the organs that need it quickly. So you got your blood sugar, right, going through, but imagine if we just relied upon only the sugars that were in our blood to deliver the energy to our organs. The organs would be sapping that out really quickly, sucking it out of the blood very quickly. So you need to have those carbohydrates much closer to where you need it. So the muscles are very energy intensive, right? They use up a lot of energy, especially when you're exercising. So you want to have good glycogen stores in the body. Otherwise, your muscles are going to fatigue. You're going to create lots of lactic acid and other type of metabolic acidic wastes because there's a deficit of carbohydrates or deficit of glycogen in the
Glycogen. Yeah.
muscles. And so the glycogen is the storage of carbohydrates, just like the the rhizome, the starchy rhizome of a plant, of a root, is that storage of the carbohydrates for the body. It's glycogen. Does that make sense?
It does. Can I buy
Yep.
glycogen as a fractal? Have I seen that?
No, you cannot. The body makes glycogen. It cannot be bought.
Okay. So if I want to get better glycogen storage, complex carbs.
You need complex carbohydrates and you need to exercise the body. And there's definitely certain exercise techniques, methods
Is that
to
where like
actually enhance your glycogen
anabolic
storage.
versus the different type of stress I'm going to put on the body, like
Yeah,
aerobic.
aerobic exercise. This is very common, especially in athletes. They understand that, and runners as well who are running like these marathons.
Right.
There's a whole procedure by which they build up their glycogen capacity so that they can store more glycogen to
Hence
fuel
more
their
stamina.
muscles, to have more stamina. Exactly. But I don't want to get too much into that area because it's definitely going to derail us.
Okay.
And it's a whole other like conversation. It's a fascinating conversation in sports nutrition.
Yeah, it's a huge one for me. Glycogen capacity is a whole nother episode.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
But one of the things I want to talk about with carbohydrates that's really important is that we have digestible carbohydrates and we have undigestible carbohydrates. So the ones we just talked about for energy are digestible. We digest them, we absorb them, we utilize them for energy, for storage. That storage can also include generating fats. So if we have too many carbohydrates that surpasses the glycogen capacity, then yes, we will put that into fat storage. That's why a lot of people tend to gain extra weight because they're eating too many concentrated starches and processed sugars.
And not utilizing it for energy.
Utilizing it, so it goes into fat storage. A little bit of that is good, like I said before, with going through the winter.
So glycogen, so it goes from the good type of sugar, from a carb to the good type of sugar in your body to glycogen, and then from there to fat storage.
Yeah, if you have an excess of it. Yep. But the undigestible carbohydrates, the ones that we cannot break down and absorb, those we call fibers. Many people have heard this term fiber. You need to get more fiber, right? Good bowel movements.
Yeah, 1,000%.
Yeah, and for sure, it definitely is. And there's different types of fibers. There are your insoluble and your soluble fibers. They definitely play different roles in the body. But in the general sense, fibers they're going to generate some bulk to move the bowels and help the muscles of the intestinal tract to actually have something to hold on to and to stimulate that whole peristaltic movement and having things to move through. If you don't have enough fiber, also known as plants, in your diet, you're gonna likely get backed up with constipation. You need to have the bulk. But what's really important about the fiber, and more conversations are being had about this out there, which is feeding the microbiome. And you need to have these undigestible carbohydrates, also known as fibers, to feed that microbiome, because it's the fermentation of those undigested fibers that generate all sorts of different metabolic compounds, chemical compounds that have tremendous bioactivity that supports our health and well-being. Everything from the health of our intestinal tract to our immune system, to our brain health. The list goes on and on and on about that. So we could get into the specifics about maybe those compounds in another talk. That'd be really exciting.
Yeah,
I'd love to do that.
Compound / aka fibers.
Yeah, and just talking about the microbiome in general and all the different compounds that bacteria can generate from good, healthy fibers, but also like what happens when you don't have the right food in, and what are the toxic compounds that can be generated from the bacteria.
Hey man, I don't really care about sounding like an idiot on this because is this probiotics?
So many people know these bacteria as probiotics.
Okay.
And yeah, probiotics, as we talked about previously, is just like this bacteria that's fermented
Right.
from some type of food.
Right.
And there are some of these strains that are good for us that actually
Yeah.
help us keep a bit more balance.
Right.
But really, we have a whole bunch of, like, literally over as high as like 1,000 plus different types of strains of bacteria
Yeah.
in our body,
So,
not
so,
only in our gut, but in our skin, our nose, our mouth.
so these fibers are compounds, or these fibers are strains, or strains are they're all interchangeable words. Probiotic. They all kind of are they,
Well, the fiber is your, the other term that's being thrown out there is prebiotic.
prebiotic.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
because then it
prebiotic,
ferments and then turns into the probiotic.
right, right. The prebiotics are the food that the bacteria will ferment to grow, to thrive, and then they generate all sorts of compounds that can support our health
Awesome.
and well-being. So in order to feed this ecosystem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I often describe the body as like a mini Earth. We are an Earth-like being, and within us we have all these little critters, all these little bugs,
1,000%.
and yeah, and there's more bugs that make up who we are than there are our own human, cells and DNA. So we want to make sure that this ecosystem,
That's a lot of
all these
bugs.
little bugs and critters, are being well taken care of. They're being fed right. And we're not toxifying our inner earth with all the junk that's out there in the world.
Wow,
So
Mike.
again,
This
as
one was
within,
deep.
so without.
This was deep. Is there anything? I mean,
Yeah.
I get to listen to this back. I think I've reached my saturation index right now. Is there anything else you want to cap on?
Well, with carbohydrates, just that there's a lot of good compounds in there, that a lot of carbohydrates actually have immune supportive properties. A lot of the, I'm not sure if you got into any of the medicinal mushroom world out there, but a lot of the important immune enhancing compounds that are found in mushrooms and fungi are known as polysaccharides. Those are carbohydrates, and they're very important for our immune system. So, carbohydrates come in many, many different forms, and they're very bioactive. And that's something that you cannot get with an isolated refined sugar, with a drug known as sugar. You cannot get that from there. That will kill you, will degenerate you. Whereas real carbohydrates from food that have all the vitamins and minerals and other phytonutrients that are part of it will actually contribute to your regeneration, your healing, by supporting that carbon side of the cycle. And if you get too much of that, too much of the refined stuff, what does it got lead to? Significant inflammation, because it is basically an assault on your defense system. And your defense system protects itself by becoming inflamed and trying to burn off what should not be in your body. So,
Mic drop, bro. Wow.
yeah.
So I love where you started to go with carbohydrates, that mushrooms are also the fungi, and that whole conversation. What was the word that started with a P?
Polysaccharides. So we've got
Polysaccharides.
monosaccharides, we've got polysaccharides. So these are basically chains that are,
So we could have a whole
singles or
other
many.
episode on mushrooms and how
At
they
some
work.
point, we can.
Wow, Mike. It just never stops.
Never stops.
It never stops.
Yeah.
Well,
just transforms.
guys, carbohydrates, part 1.
Part 1.
Thank you so much for your time, Mike, and always teaching me, man.
Yeah, thank you for being on top of the time too.
Yeah, dude. Guys,
Appreciate that.
We'll see you next week, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.